Hi everyone, we're back with 1984 and back with Otis. I'm taking care of him today so you could see him on the video. I just tried to film this and he knocked over my phone, so hopefully that doesn't happen again. Before you watch this video, please watch chapters 5 to 7, and that should help you understand this. We're skipping ahead a little bit. We're starting with chapter 8 today. Okay, Otis, I think I'm going to have to move you. There we go. Okay. It's 21 pages, so we'll see how far we get. We may not get through the whole thing. And on my book, it's page 72. I'm going to post the page number that you're going to start on from your file that you're reading. Okay. From somewhere at the bottom of a passage, the smell of roasting coffee, real coffee, not victory coffee, came floating out into the street. Winston paused involuntarily. For perhaps 2 seconds he was back in the half-forgotten world of his childhood. Then a door banged, seeming to cut off the smell as abruptly as though it had been a sound. He had walked several kilometers over pavements, and his varicose ulcer was throbbing. This was the second time in 3 weeks that he had missed an evening at the community center, a rash act since you could be certain that the number of your attendances at the center were carefully checked. So basically there's community events that aren't required, but if you don't attend, people pay attention and wonder where you are, and you're more likely to be reported to the thought police. In principle, a party member had no spare time and was never alone except in bed. It was assumed that when he was not working, eating, or sleeping, he would be taking part in some kind of communal recreations. To do anything that suggested a taste for solitude, even to go for a walk by yourself, was always slightly dangerous. So you can't have your own life at all. There was a word for it in Newspeak. Own life, it was called, meaning individualism and eccentricity. But this evening, as he came out of the ministry, the balminess of the April air had tempted him. The sky was a warmer blue than he had seen in that year, and suddenly the long, noisy evening at the center, the boring, exhausting games, the lectures, the creaking camaraderie oiled by gin, had seemed intolerable. On impulse, he had turned away from the bus stop and wandered off into the labyrinth of London, first south, then east, then north again, losing himself along unknown streets and hardly bothering in which direction he was going. If there is hope, he had written in the diary, it lies in the proles. The words kept coming back to him, statement of a mystical truth and a palpable absurdity. He was somewhere in the vague brown-colored slums to the north and east of what had once been St. Pancras Station. He was walking up a cobbled street of little 2-storied houses with battered doorways, which gave straight on the pavement and which were somehow curiously suggestive of rat holes. There were puddles of filthy water here and there among the cobbles. In and out of the dark doorways and down narrow alleyways that branched off on either side, people swarmed in astonishing numbers. Girls in full bloom, with crudely lipsticked mouths, and youths who chased the girls, and swollen, waddled women who showed you what the girls would be like in 10 years' time, and old bent creatures shuffling along on splayed feet, and ragged barefoot children who played in the puddles and then scattered at angry yells from their mothers. So he's walking in the slums. So this is where all of the Pearls live, and you can tell by the description that they're all very poor. The kids are wearing rags, people are running around, the women are described as swollen even though they're pregnant, the girls have lipstick put on and they haven't done their makeup very well, and the boys are chasing them. They just don't have any money. Perhaps a quarter of the windows in the streets were broken and boarded up. Most of the people paid no attention to Winston. A few eyed him with a sort of guarded curiosity. 2 monstrous women with brick-red forearms folded across their aprons were talking outside a doorway. Winston caught scraps of conversation as he approached. Yes, I say to her, that's all very well, I says, but if you'd been in my place, you'd have done the same as what I'd done. It's easy to criticize, I says, but you can't go the same problems as what I got. "Ah," said the other, "that's just it. That's just where it is." The strident voices stopped abruptly. The women studied him in hostile silence as he went past. But it was not hostility exactly, merely a kind of wariness, a momentary stiffening as the passing of some unfamiliar animal. The blue overalls of the party could not be a common sight in a street like this. So Winston's walking by some proles, and they notice that he's a member of the party, and they stop talking, and they know he doesn't belong there. Indeed, it was unwise to be seen in such places unless you had definite business there. The patrols might stop you if you happened to run into them. "May I see your papers, comrade? What are you doing here? What time did you leave work? Is this your usual way home?" And so on and so forth. Not that there was any rule against walking home by an unusual route, but it was enough to draw attention to you if the thought police heard about it. Suddenly, the whole street was in commotion. There were yells of warning from all sides. People were shooting in the doorways like rabbits. A young woman leaped out of the doorway a little ahead of Winston, grabbed up a tiny child playing in a puddle, whipped her apron around it, and leapt back again, all in one movement. All the same instant, a man in a concertina-like black suit, who had emerged from a side alley, ran toward Winston, pointing excitedly to the sky. "Steamer," he yelled. "Look out, governor. Bang over her head. Lay down quick." Steamer was a nickname which, for some reason, the Pearls applied to rocket bombs. So the Pearls are about to be bombed, which is why the mother went and grabbed the child, and they call them steamers. Winston promptly flung himself on his face. The Pearls were nearly always right when they gave you a warning of this kind. They seemed to possess some kind of instinct which told them several seconds in advance when a rocket was coming, although the rocket supposedly traveled faster than sound. Winston clasped his forearms around his head. There was a roar that seemed to make the pavement heave. A shower of light objects pattered onto his back. When he stood up, he found that he was covered with fragments of glass from the nearest window. He walked on. The bomb had demolished a group of houses 200 meters up the street. A black plume of smoke hung in the sky, and below it a cloud of plaster dust in which a crowd was already forming round the ruins. There was a little pile of plaster laying on the pavement ahead of him, and in the middle of it he could see a bright red streak. When he got up to it, he saw that it was a human hand severed at the wrist. Apart from the bloody stump, the hand was so completely whitened as to resemble a plaster cast. So there's a hand chopped off at the wrist, just lying in the street that he walks by. He kicked the thing into the gutter, and then, to avoid the crowd, turned down a side street to the right. Within 3 or 4 minutes, he was out of the area which the bomb had affected, and the sordid swarming of life of the streets was going on as though nothing had happened. It was nearly 20 hours, and the drinking shops which the Pearls frequented, pubs they called them, were choked with customers. From their grimy swing doors, endlessly opening and shutting, there came forth a smell of urine, sawdust, and sour beer. In an angle formed by a projecting house front, 3 men were standing very close together, the middle of them holding a folded-up newspaper, which the other 2 were studying over his shoulders. Even before he was near enough to make out the expression on their faces, Winston could see absorption in every line of their bodies. It was obviously some serious piece of news that they were reading. He was a few paces away from them when suddenly the group broke up and 2 of the men were in a violent altercation. The men got into a fight. For a moment, they seemed almost on the point of blows. Okay, so they're almost fighting. They're yelling at each other. "Can't you bleeding well listen to what I say? I tell you no number ending in 7 ain't won for 14 months. "Yes, it has then. "No, it has not. Back 'ome I got the 'ole lot of 'em for over 2 years wrote down on a piece of paper. I takes 'em down regular as the clock, and I tell you no number ending in 7. Yes, a 7 as one. I could pretty near tell you the bleeding number. 407 it ended in. It were in February, 2nd week in February. February, your grandmother. I got it all down in black and white, and I tell you no number. Oh, pack it in," said the 3rd man. They were talking about the lottery. So this is what Winston was talking about before. We finally see it happening, that the proles concern themselves with like the newspaper, the sports, with gambling. And they win like small amounts of money, and that's how the party tries to keep them happy. Winston looked back when he had gone 30 meters. They were still arguing with vivid, passionate faces. The lottery, with its weekly payout of enormous prizes, was the one public event to which the proles paid serious attention. It was probable that there were some millions of proles for whom the lottery was the principal, if not the only reason for remaining alive. It was their delight, their folly, their anodyne, their intellectual stimulant. Where the lottery was concerned, even people who could barely read and write seemed capable of intricate calculation and staggering feats of memory. So this is a way that basically the proles just focus on the lottery because it seems like the only way that any of them are able to get enough money to survive. There was a whole tribe of men who made a living simply by selling systems, forecasts, and lucky amulets. So like a lucky charm. Winston had nothing to do with the running of the lottery, which was managed by the Ministry of Plenty, but he was aware, indeed everyone in the party was aware, that the prizes were largely imaginary. Only small sums were actually paid out, the winners of the big prizes being non-existent persons. In the absence of any real intercommunication between one part of Oceania and another, this was not difficult to arrange. So, like, people will get small amounts of money, like, with the scratch cards where you can win, like, $5 or $10 or something like that. That's probably more what people actually win. But any of the ones with the big sums of money, like, the party just makes up a person and awards it to them, so they don't actually have to give it to any of the proles. But if there was hope, it lay in the proles. You had to cling on to that. When you put it in words, it sounded reasonable. It was when you looked at the human beings passing you on the pavement that it became an act of faith. The street into which he had turned ran downhill. He had a feeling that he had been this neighborhood before and that there was a main thoroughfare not far away. From somewhere ahead, there came a din of shouting voices. The street took a sharp turn and then ended in a flight of steps which led down into a sunken alley where a few stall keepers were selling tired-looking vegetables. At this moment, Winston remembered where he was. The alley led out into the main street, and down the next turning, not 5 minutes away, was the junk shop where he had bought the blank book which was now his diary, and in a small stationer's shop not far away, he had bought his pen holder and his bottle of ink. He paused for a moment at the top of the steps. On the opposite side of the alley, there was a dingy little pub whose windows appeared to be frosted over, but in reality were merely coated with dust. A very old man, bent but active, with white mustaches that bristled forward like those of a prawn, like a shrimp, which is very odd comparison, pushed open the swing door and went in. As Winston stood watching it occurred to him that the old man, who must be 80 at the least, had already been middle-aged when the revolution happened. He and a few others like him were the last links that now existed with the vanished world of capitalism. In the party itself, there were not many people left whose ideas had been formed before the revolution. The older generation had mostly been wiped out in the great purges of the 50s and 60s, and the few who survived had long been terrified into complete intellectual surrender. So the people who were middle-aged when the revolution happened and the party came into control were either killed or they keep quiet so they don't get killed. If there was anyone alive who could give you a truthful account of conditions in the early part of the century, it could only be a prole. Suddenly, the passage from the history book that he'd copied into his diary came back into Winston's mind, and a lunatic impulse took hold of him. He would go into the pub, he would scrape acquaintance with the old man and question him. He would say to him, "Tell me about your life when you were a boy. What was it like in those days? Were things better than they are now, or were they worse?" Hurriedly, lest he should have time to become frightened, he descended the steps and crossed the narrow street. It was madness, of course. As usual, there was no definite rule against talking to proles and frequenting their pubs, but it was far too unusual an action to pass unnoticed. If the patrols appeared, he might plead an attack of faintness, but it was not likely they would believe him. So he's risking his life to go into this bar, this pub, and ask this man questions about his life. He pushed open the door, and a hideous, cheesy smell of sour beer hit him in the face. As he entered, the din of voices dropped to about half its volume. Behind his back, he could feel everyone eyeing his blue overalls. A game of darts, which was going on at the other end of the room, interrupted itself for perhaps as much as 30 seconds. The old man, whom he had followed, was standing at the bar, having some kind of altercation with the barman, a large, stout, hook-nosed young man with enormous forearms. A knot of others standing round with glasses in their hands were watching the scene. Okay, so again, there's another fight. "I arsed you civil enough, didn't I?" said the old man, straightening his shoulders pugnaciously. "You tell me you ain't got pint mug and the old bleeding boozer." "And what in hell's name is a pint?" said the barman, leaning forward with the tips of his fingers on the counter. "Ark at him, calls itself a barman and doesn't know what a pint is. Why, a pint's the ol' 'alf a quart, and there's 4 quarts to the gallon. I'll teach you the ABC next." "Never heard of 'em," said the barman shortly. "Liter and a half liter, that's all we serve. There's the glasses on the shelf in front of you." "I like a pint," persisted the old man. "You could 'a' drawed me off a pint easy enough. We didn't have the bleeding liters when I was a young man." "When you were a young man, we were all living in the treetops," said the barman, with a glance at the other customers. There was a shout of laughter, and the uneasiness caused by Winston's entry seemed to disappear. The old man's white stubbled face had flushed pink. He turned away, muttering to himself, and bumped into Winston. Winston caught him gently by the arm. "May I offer you a drink?" he said. "You're a gent," said the other, straightening his shoulders again. He appeared not to have noticed Winston's blue overalls. "Pint," he added aggressively to the barman. "Pint of wallop." The barman swished 2 half-liters of dark brown beer into thick glasses, which he had rinsed in a bucket under the counter. Beer was the only drink you could get in the Pearl pubs. The Pearls were not supposed to drink gin, though in practice they could get hold of it easily enough. The game of darts was in full swing again, and the knot of men at the bar had begun talking about lottery tickets. Winston's presence was forgotten for a moment. There was a deal table under the window where he and the old man could talk without fear of being overheard. It was horribly dangerous, but at any rate there was no telescreen in the room, a point he had made sure of as soon as he came in. So Winston wanted to make sure that no one would hear him and that hopefully he wouldn't get caught. Like no one could hear him and the telescreen couldn't see him or anything like that. "'E could 'a' draw me off a pint," grumbled the old man as he settled down behind his glass. "A 1/2 liter ain't enough. It don't satisfy, and an old liter's too much. It starts my bladder running, let alone the price." "You must have seen great changes since you were a young man," said Winston tentatively. The old man's pale blue eyes moved from the darts aboard to the bar, and from the bar to the door of the gents, as though it were in the bar room that he expected the changes to have occurred. "The beer was better," he said finally, "and cheaper. When I was a young man, mild beer, wallop we used to call it, was 4 pence a pint. That was before the war, of course." "Which war was that?" said Winston. "It's all the wars," said the old man vaguely. He took up his glass and his shoulders straightened again. "'Ere's wishing you the very best of 'ealth." In his lean throat, the sharp-pointed Adam's apple made a surprisingly rapid up-and-down movement, and the beer vanished. Winston went to the bar and came back with 2 more half-liters. The old man appeared to have forgotten his prejudice against drinking a full liter. "You are very much older than I am," said Winston. "You must have been a grown man before I was born. You can remember what it was like in the old days, before the Revolution. People of my age don't really know anything about those times. We can only read about them in books, and what it says in books may not be true. I should like your opinion on that. The history books say that life before the Revolution was completely different from what it is now. There was the most terrible oppression, injustice, poverty, worse than anything we can imagine. Here in London, the great mass of people never had enough to eat from birth to death. Half of them hadn't even boots on their feet. They worked 12 hours a day, they left school at 9, they slept 10 in a room, and at the same time there were a very few people, only a few thousand, only a few thousands, the capitalists they were called, who were rich and powerful. They owned everything that there was to own. They lived in great gorgeous houses with 37 servants. They rode about in motor cars and 4-horse carriages. They drank champagne. They wore top hats. The old man brightened suddenly. Top hats? He said. Funny you should mention 'em. The same thing come in my head only yesterday. I don't know why. I was just thinking I ain't seen a top hat in years. Gone right out they have. The last time I wore one was at my sister-in-law's funeral, and that was, well, I couldn't give you the date, but it must have been 50 years ago. Of course, it was only hired for the occasion, you understand. It isn't very important about the top hat, said Winston patiently. The point is, these capitalists, they and a few lawyers and priests and so forth who lived on them were the lords of the earth. Everything existed for their benefit. You, the ordinary people, the workers, were their slaves. They could do what they liked with you. They could ship you off to Canada like cattle. They could sleep with your daughters if they chose. They could order you to be flogged with something called a cat o' nine tails. You had to take your cap off when you passed them. Every capitalist went about with a gang of lackeys who... The old man brightened again. Lackeys, he said. Now there's a word I ain't heard since ever so long. Lackeys. The regular takes me back, that does. I recollect. Oh, donkeys. Years ago I used to sometimes go to the park of a Sunday afternoon to hear the blokes making speeches. Salvation Army, Roman Catholics, Jews, Indians, all sorts there was. And there was one bloke, well, I couldn't give you his name, but a real powerful speaker he was. He didn't half give it to him. Lackeys, he says, lackeys of the bourgeoisie, flunkies of the ruling class, parasites, that was another of them, and yes, it definitely called him hyenas. Of course, he was referring to the Labour Party, you understand. Winston had the feeling that they were talking at cross purposes. So Winston's trying to have a deep conversation with this man, and this man just focuses on things like top hats and lackeys and doesn't even necessarily say things that make a whole lot of sense to Winston. Winston's just trying to have a serious conversation about history, but this man can't do it. What I really want to know was this, he said. Do you feel that you have more freedom now than you had in those days? Are you treated more like a human being? In the old days, the rich people, the people at the top, the House of Lords, put it the old man reminiscently. The House of Lords, if you like. What I am asking is, were these people able to treat you as inferior simply because they were rich and you were poor? Is it a fact, for instance, that you had to call them sir and take off your cap when you passed them? The old man appeared to think deeply. He drank off about a quarter of his beer before answering. Yes, he said, they liked you to touch your cap to him. It showed respect, like, I didn't agree with it myself, but I'd done it often enough. Had to, as you might say. And was it unusual? I'm only quoting what I've read in history books. Was it unusual for these people and their servants to push you off the pavement into the gutter? One of them pushed me once, said the old man. I recollected as if it was yesterday. It was boat race night, terribly rowdy they used to get on boat race night, and I bumps into a young bloke on Shaftesbury Avenue, quite the gent he was, dress shirt, top hat, black overcoat. He was kind of zigzagging across the pavement, and I bumps into him accidental-like. He says, why can't you look where you're going? He says. I says, "'Sh you think you bought the bleeding pavement? He says, I'll twist your bloody head off if you get fresh with me. I says, you're drunk. I'll give you in charge in half a minute. I says, and if you'll believe me, he puts his and on my chest and gives me a shove as pretty near sent me under the wheels of a bus. Well, I was young in them days, and I was going to have fetched him one only. A sense of helplessness took hold of Winston. The old man's memory was nothing but a rubbish heap of details. One could question him all day without getting any real information. The party histories might still be true, after a fashion, then might even be completely true. He made a last attempt. Perhaps I have not made myself clear, he said. What I'm trying to say is this. You've been alive a very long time. You lived half your life before the Revolution. In 1925, for instance, you were already grown up. Would you say, from what you can remember, that life in 1925 was better than it is now, or worse? If you could choose, would you prefer to live then or now? The old man looked meditatively at the darts board. He finished up his beer more slowly than before. When he spoke, it was with a tolerant, philosophic air as though the beer had mellowed him. "I know what you expect me to say," he said. "You expect me to say as I'd sooner be young again. Most people say they'd sooner be young, if you ask them. You got your health and your strength when you're young. But when you get to my time of life, you ain't never well. I suffer something wicked from my feet, and my bladder's just terrible. 6 and 7 times a night it has me out of bed. On the other, and there's great advantages in being an old man. You ain't got the same worries, no truck with women, and that's a great thing. I ain't had a woman for near on 30 year, if you'd credit me, nor want to, what's more." Winston sat back against the windowsill. It was no use going on. He was about to buy some more beer when the old man suddenly got up and shuffled rapidly into the stinking urinal at the side of the room. The extra half-liter was already working on him. Winston sat for a minute or two gazing at his empty glass and hardly noticed when his feet carried him out into the street again. Within 20 years, at the most, he reflected, the huge and simple question, was life better before the Revolution than it is now, would have ceased once and for all to be answerable. But in effect it was unanswerable even now, since the few scattered survivors from the ancient world were incapable of comparing one age to another. They remembered a million useless things: a quarrel with a workmate, a hunt for a lost bicycle pump, the expression on a long-dead sister's face, the swirl of dust on a windy morning 70 years ago, but all the relevant facts were outside the range of their vision. They were like the ant, which can see small objects but not large ones, and when memory failed and written records were falsified, when that happened, the claim of the party to have improved the conditions of human life had got to be accepted, because there did not exist, and never again could exist, any standard against which it could be tested. So this is the problem when you get rid of history. You can't look at what was going on before and compare it to what's going on now, and we're seeing with this man that his memory is not accurate. He talks about small details, but he doesn't talk about the big ideas that Winston wants. At this moment, his train of thought stopped abruptly. He halted and looked up. He was in a narrow street, with a few dark little shops interspersed along dwelling houses. Immediately above his head there hung 3 discolored metal balls, which looked as if they had been gilded. He seemed to know the place. Of course. He was standing outside the junk shop where he had bought his diary. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. We are still on chapter 8. We have another 10 pages or so of it. But I think the interaction with the prole gives you a lot to think about. All right, I'll see y'all soon.